Hello, and thank you for tuning into my final presentation. My name is Michael Moheban, and today I'm going to go in depth on the piece Automedon with the Horses of Achilles. Um, so here we go. Let's just hop right into it. The Automedon with the Horses of Achilles was painted by Henry Renaud, and it was painted on a very large canvas with oil paint in 1868. And Renault painted this when he was just 25, so around my age, which is pretty impressive. I couldn't even imagine painting something this large, and I'll get into the size in a little bit. And unfortunately, he passed away shortly after the Prussian-French War, actually in the war, which I will discuss in a little bit. But he didn't have to serve in the war, but he was a little bit of a patriot, and he didn't have to serve in the war because he did win the French Academy's Rome Prize in 1866, which pretty much made him exempt from the draft at that time. But he volunteered anyway. He was a patriot. He wanted to fight for France, which I think was really the patriotism and the feelings associated with going into battle that you know you might not win. I think he does a really good job at conveying that. Especially within the horses. Here, let me just go and get my laser pointer. Here we go, laser pointer. And that is very evident in the extreme detail of the horses and even the emotions visible in the horses, which I'll get into in a little bit. But a little bit of the history of this piece. It was painted towards the end of the neoclassical movement. The neoclassical movement was a movement which pretty much appreciated classical antiquities and mythology and classical, deification and gods, and it was a depiction of those types of things as well as mythology. And the neoclassical movement incorporated elements of all sorts of other types of art into those depictions of, the deified figures or the other figures which are of extreme importance. And eventually the neoclassical style it did die down, and it eventually became replaced with the Rococo style. And this largely had to do, it coincided with a few archaeological discoveries at the time. So they were very intrigued into ancient times, and they essentially applied new techniques that they've learned all the way up until the 19th century to, the classical antiquities that they have now been re-intrigued through those discoveries in the archaeological sites. As I mentioned earlier, this was painted just 2 years before Renaud's unfortunate death in the French-Prussian War in 1870. And he draws inspiration from classical mythology, and this is a scene here depicting an infamous battle in Homer's Iliad. And it incorporates extreme idealistic elements, and that's very evident in the depiction of the muscles of the horse here and Automedon, as well as the other horse in the back here, Xanthos, I believe. And this horse is named Balios. So getting into a little bit about the piece itself, it's a really, really big painting. One of the reasons I chose to focus on this painting was because I've actually seen it in person. I stared at it for probably 15 minutes and was speechless the whole time. It's 10 feet by 10 feet. It's displayed at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And again, it's another classical style incorporating extreme idealistic elements, which I'm going to discuss next. But I just want you to keep in mind that the painting was 10 feet wide by 10 feet tall, which gives the total area of the piece 100 square feet of area. And you can see the horses and Automedon take up a good, I would say, around 50% of the entire piece, which is around 50 square feet of pretty much pure muscle. So so the size of this piece adds to the sheer divine nature of it. So first, let's start off on the extremely idealized muscles of Balios and Xanthos, Achilles' divine horses. Right, so Renaud was a horseman, so he certainly was familiar with the anatomy of horses here. So all of these extenuations of the anatomy of the horse are done on purpose, and they're done to give the horses a divine sense, a very divine sense, right? Because Automedon is fighting with Achilles, they are mythological figures, right? They are extremely powerful. And so are these horses. These horses, as you can see in the emotion, as I'll go by later, are almost conveying the same types of emotions as Automedon is here, but there is a little bit of difference, and we'll get into that in a second. But next here, adding to the sense of kind of symmetry that we have going on here in the yin and the yang, the elements of the piece that work really well together to overall project a really strong, forceful sense to the piece. And one of those elements is how Renaud mirrored the anatomy of Automedon here in his foot, as well as Balios' foot. There, if you were to draw a line right down the middle here, there'd be a pretty good mirror image of each other. And these added elements of symmetry and harmony work together to give that painting a super divine feeling, like a speechless feeling when you view it, because those two things are working together, and something that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in this slide that also works together to project sense of power. So moving on, back to Xanthos here, which is the black horse in the back. Xanthos' neck is unnaturally thick, and as I just discussed, Renaud knew this. It was done on purpose. And it was done to give, again, an idealized sense to these horses. Everybody knew that their necks weren't necessarily this wide, but they were done that way to really show how strong these horses were. And in the mythology, the way it goes is these horses pass away, they sacrifice themselves, but Automedon lives. 4 people tried to kill him, and he killed the 4th person that tried to kill him. That's how strong he was in chariot with Xanthos and Balios, his horses. And this adds another element, a divine element, to the painting. It's just really, I'm having trouble finding the correct words to describe it, but it just makes me speechless when I saw it in person. That's how, I think divine's a good word, but that's just how divine the sense of this painting is in person. So moving on, there is also very strong lighting cast on Balios and Automedon. And the lighting is from pretty far out of the frame, potentially towards where they will be heading to battle, right? So that lighting is working together with the symmetry discussed earlier and the idealization of the horses here to really, really project a sense of force and power into the viewer. No matter who you are going to, even if you don't know the story of Automedon and his horses, and Achilles' horses, you would still think that this painting is just absolutely magnificent because of the idealization, because of these elements that work together, these muscles mirroring the type of hyperbolization in Automedon as well as Xanthos. Because we see here, the human body definitely does not have that crease down the middle here, and that was done to really highlight the muscles on either side and add a little bit of a shadow, again to highlight that muscle and give a really good sense of power to Automedon as well as his horses here, which I think is a great example, which I think is a great example for neoclassical pieces. This type of extenuation is really prevalent, and it really makes up one of the main characteristics of neoclassical pieces, other than the subject, which is usually characters based out of mythology or religious figures. So moving on here, another element that I discussed earlier that I told you I'd talk about later, which we're going to talk about right now, are the lines in the hillside behind. In the angle, Balios is twisting his neck. And at the sight line of Xanthos, the sight line of Xanthos aligns with the angle that Balios is twisting his neck, as well as the angle of the field, or not the field, but the hill in the background. So these lines work to create a horizontal element to the piece. Well, let me just get my pen out here. Oh. While excuse me, that just skipped around. But anyway, these lines here, the sight line of Xanthos and the angle Balios is twisting his neck, as well as the hill in the background, work to horizontal lines. And we see some vertical lines here in Balios's leg, as well as Automedon standing, his leg, and then his arm pointing straight up creates a vertical element. And these boxy vertical horizontal elements create a great sense of power in a sense of force, right? So where that light was shining from, right? These characters are about to charge there. They're about to win the battle. That's what this is just screaming to me, especially with all the elements here, especially in the muscles with an additional vertical lines here, all hidden within the Renault's just, for how young he was, it's just absolutely amazing. And again, the massive painting 10 feet by 10 foot, it was bolded a whole bunch when I started talking about this bullet point. And that's really important to remember here. Another part of this painting is the size. Its sheer size is also part of what makes it project huge senses of power and forcefulness as well. So getting into a little bit about the symbolism and I guess the meaning of the entire thing. The whole point of this is Renault wanted to foreshadow disaster in the piece. Actually, I'm about to tell you a quote from Renault about this piece. And he said, "The horses, aware that their master, Achilles, is taking them into combat, and that this combat will cost him his life, struggle and rest with Automedon. I wanted to give the picture a foretaste of disaster." And I think he does a really good job at that. And if we take a look at the horses in their emotions, in their facial expressions, they look scared. They look like they're scared, but they aren't running away. They're in the face of fear. They remain courageous, and they will go out there with Automedon. And Automedon is a strong charioteer in the Iliad, and with the help of the horses, Xanthos and Balios, he kills all of his enemies that attempted to kill him. And I think that in and of itself is a wonderful representation of the power of the horses here, because Automedon has Xanthos and Balios with him. He is able to beat not 1, 2, 3, but 4 of his enemies without even incurring damage. The horses did happen to perish, but he, with the help in the sacrifice of Balios and Xanthos, was able to win the battle. And with the help of the horses, he kills Aretos and takes his armor. That's the whole, I guess, what Automedon's role in this specific story in the Iliad is. But I think I just forgot my thought, but it'll come back to me. Anyway, the horse is the tool which allows Automedon to become, in this story, unkillable, instead unleashing fury on his opponents. None of his opponents could kill him. Instead, he killed all of them. And that was because of the horse. And I just think that's, again, a wonderful aspect of this piece. And I just remembered what I was going to say. This, most of the viewers at the time who are going to see this piece were very familiar with Homer's Iliad and would have definitely known this scene to be about before when Automedon was about to go into battle. So that's also another important aspect of this, is people recognizing the scene in the meaning of just the scene, apart from the artwork itself. In the idealized horses convey an unconceivable amount of power. to Automedon, right? The emotion in the horse's eyes that we talked about earlier show courage in the face of a sure sacrifice. And this courage, led by Automedon, is what allowed him to become victorious in battle, becoming just pretty much untouchable, like I talked about earlier. In the inclusion of these strong horizontal and vertical features in the piece, like I discussed a little bit earlier, they work together to convey a really wonderful forcefulness to the piece, as well as giving it a great sense of life, which I really enjoy. And again, I really want to highlight that this piece is huge. It's 100 square feet, and I would, if I am a betting man, so I'd be willing to bet that there's over 50 square feet of pure muscle depiction in this. And I think that's just, please, if you can, please go look at this piece. It's definitely worth going to Boston to look at. It's magnificent. It's just absolutely amazing. But I digress. But how the role of horses, how in the 19th century, when Renaud painted this in 1868, horses were a very integral part of society in the late 19th century. They were used for transportation, mostly to get around, as well as transporting goods and services, as well as trade. They pretty much allowed people to expand. They allowed societies to expand, and as a result, there was a great appreciation for that new capability because of the horse. Horses were revered. There was horse racing. There was draft horses being bred and sold. And there is an unfortunate side to horses in France in the late 19th century, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. But horses were also an integral part of the military. More horses you had, the stronger your military was. And that's going to become relevant right now when we talk about the Prussian-French War of 1870, the war which unfortunately had claimed Renaud's life. And the Prussians defeated the French. And the Prussians had 70,000 horses, and 600,000 soldiers, while the French had just under half, around half that, horse-wise, at around 43,000 horses, and then around 250,000 soldiers. The large number of the horses available to the Prussians gave them an incredible advantage in battle, so much so that it led to the French defeat and the siege of Paris in 1870, which had a little bit of some ugly consequences, which we'll get into right now. After the siege of Paris in 1870, the Parisian population had no other choice but to turn to horse meat, as there was a shortage of other meats like beef, pork, and poultry. And this was difficult for the people of France at the time. This was not their first choice. This was a last resort case scenario because horse racing was one of the most popular sports at the time. People had a huge respect for horses. They didn't want to kill them just for food. They knew that they were just more than a meat animal. They knew they allowed society to expand. They allowed the economy to grow. They allowed more people to get connected, cultures to intertwine. They just allowed so much growth that people didn't want to disrespect that or the horse by eating them. And like I said, they were very well respected and revered for their extremely vast utility. And they essentially allowed for expanded trade and transportation, creating wealth for their owners. And this created a deep sense of appreciation, which is displayed nicely in the extreme detail of the horses. I'd be willing to bet that Renaud spent more time painting the horses than he did painting Automedon. And I think that goes to show the respect and appreciation people at the time had for horses, especially because Renaud was only 25 when he painted this, right? So he was a very young man. And throughout his young life, one thing was certain: horses. He loved horses. He had an extreme appreciation for horses. And I think that is really, really displayed well here. So in conclusion, the horse was an integral part of society at the time, and were present in many aspects of daily life. As a result, they were revered for their vast utility and loved almost by all. And this is illustrated nicely by the idealization of the horses and how much detail is present, as well as just the sheer muscular extenuation that showcases nicely the collective adoration that of horses that humans had towards horses at the time. And I think that that's a really great example of how close horses and humans were, as well as how amazing this piece is. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I know I enjoyed the class. So with that, that's it. Thank you. And Beth, thank you. And yeah,